Okay, so you born in the US and you work here in Europe.
Yeah.
Could you please tell us that what is the difference between the mindset of the Americans and the mindset of Europeans?
Well, I guess first I should say, to be clear, that I came to the UK when I was quite young. So I was 7 or 8 years old, and I've mostly been in Europe ever since. So I've been quite sort of indoctrinated by the European mindset, to the degree that there is such a thing. Um, yeah, I guess, obviously I'm always talking a lot to my colleagues in America, and um, you know, I think there are differences among people in America and differences among people in Europe. But what I enjoy about Americans is their energy, their kind of enthusiasm, um, their kind of directness. And sometimes with Europeans, I feel like they're maybe a bit more worldly, a bit more of a sense of some of the complications of things. The Americans maybe are more kind of solution-minded, and the Europeans maybe a bit more a sense of, a bit more of the tragic sense of the difficulty of things.
Yeah, and maybe we can see that in politics as well, because maybe, I don't know, I didn't live in the US, but as I examine the US politics, it's more simple. Because here in Europe, you must have like a broader vision for the world. What is your take on that?
Um, More simple in what sense, do you mean?
Like the messages.
Yeah, I think, one difference, I think, in the political culture of the United States is it has a sense still of this kind of role in the world, which is a kind of dominant aspect of American discussion. And I think in some people you see that very strongly, particularly with President Biden, the recent president. I think the way that he spoke about, the free world and America as the leader of the free world, that kind of language to me, and I think to a number of people in Europe, seemed a little strange or a little maybe old-fashioned. But that kind of rhetoric, I think, is more a feature of, there is this tradition of America as the leader, and America as the exceptional country, America as the essential, indispensable country. And obviously there are different views on that. I think President Obama was coming from a rather different position, and President Trump also. But nevertheless, I think there's that set of expectations around the United States that calls for a particular kind of response. And in Europe, I think, perhaps there's more uncertainty about the European position in the world.
That's true. Today is 2nd of August, and yesterday, the Trump administration made tariffs.
Indeed.
For Brazil, it's, if I'm correct, it's 50%. For the European Union, it's 15%. What's your opinion? How would you describe the current relationship between the US and the world, and the US and the European Union?
Well, President Trump has taken a novel approach to the US relations with other countries, with the rest of the world, and with Europe. And I think, to what would really capture the change, I think, is that he sees the relationship very much, I think he has a kind of economic mindset, and
because he's coming from an economic background.
Yeah, he's a businessman. Yeah. And for him, it's all about the bottom line. And I think, he looks at the countries and he says, are we beating you or are you beating us? And the way he calculates that is, are you paying us more than we're paying you? And so with countries where the United States is buying more stuff from them than they're buying from us, he feels like something is wrong. And so I think that's not a very, nuanced view. Obviously, it's not very compatible with the way that countries have, traditionally approached trade within the broad trading system of the World Trade Organization. And it really makes a surprisingly little distinction between countries that are allies, traditional allies of the United States and others. So among the countries you mentioned, European countries, Brazil, Taiwan has very high tariffs. Again, these are important, historic allies mostly of the United States. But he doesn't look at things in a strategic sense. He looks at things in this rather mercantile, zero-sum, transactional way. And that is a real shock to people who have been watching the United States over a period of time. And I think it's particularly a shock for many people in Europe because they have seen the transatlantic relationship as the kind of key reference point of the European approach to the world. And
yes, we thought that we are friends.
Yeah, we thought that we were like special friends, best friends even. And now we find that we're just, being treated the same way as others, and that perhaps even Trump has a little bit, more respect or for people who approach countries who approach things like he does,
like Russia,
which is more like Russia, more like China. Of course, Trump's relationship with Russia is deteriorating now. It's going downhill, but nevertheless, I think it started from a sense of, some kind of affinity. Whereas with Europe, the Europeans are really struck by the way that it starts from this position almost of antagonism, and that is a surprise. There's some relief in Europe that things haven't been worse, I think, among the people I speak to. The NATO summit was a relief because Trump is still committed to NATO. Yeah. The tariffs, well, there was a deal, but it's not a very good deal. And, then Ukraine, well, we'll see. As I said, Trump is a little bit turning away from Russia. These are the three things, but altogether it adds up to a big shock for the Europeans as their best friend is not being so friendly.
Yeah, and there were loads of criticism towards Ursula von der Leyen because mostly from Hungary, but all over from Europe, they said that we could have a better deal with the United States. Do you think that these are right arguments?
I think if you, it's like the deal is quite, there's some ambiguity in the deal. It's not really clear what all the deal adds up to. But nevertheless, I think the deal made Europe look weak. It made it look like we were going to throw over our principles and accept something which is fundamentally unfair in order to keep our friendship with the United States. And I think it would have been better for Europe to be a bit tougher and better for Ursula von der Leyen to be a bit more transactional in her turn, to say, you need us, we need you. We're very interested in working together, but if not, we have some tools at our disposal, and I think we should have used them a bit more. But of course, it's difficult because Trump can more or less do what he wants in the United States, whereas Ursula von der Leyen has to deal with all the countries of the European Union, and some of the member states were really nervous and wanted to make a deal. So I think her hands were a bit tied, but I would have liked a stronger stance.
You wrote an article recently about Trump's approach towards multinational, international multilateral organizations. What's your take on that?
He hates them. Trump hates international organizations.
Answer, yeah.
That's the short answer. And he hates them for a lot of reasons. First of all, he hates them because he thinks America is a powerful country and it doesn't need rules. It can do better without them. Then he thinks these organizations have been taken over by a kind of ideology which he associates with wokeness, with the pursuit of everything he hates, diversity, inclusion. He thinks that they're biased against Israel and anti-Semitic, and so he objects to them in that way as well. And then he thinks they're too expensive. He thinks that America pays too much. So he hates them for a lot of reasons. And I think at the bottom line really is that international organizations are created to make international relations more predictable, more stable, so that you know what's coming and you have an organization, it's the same, you know where you are. And Trump hates all that. He likes surprise, he likes unpredictability, and he likes, one deal at a time, transactionalism. So it's not surprising that he doesn't like these organizations. But what my colleague and I said in the article is, he's tearing up a lot of the structure. He's pulling out of a lot of organizations. He's cutting a lot of funding. And I think there's more to come. We may see stuff with the World Trade Organization. He's already pulled out of the Paris Agreement, the World Health Organization.
UNESCO, maybe?
Pulled, disengaged from the Human Rights Council, cut funding or suspended funding to a lot of other international organizations. But there's some that he likes. And the ones that he likes are the ones where the United States has a key role. So he likes the United Nations because the US has a place on the Security Council, but he thinks it needs to change. And he likes the IMF and the World Bank because, again, the US is quite influential in these organizations. It's the only country that effectively has a veto. But again, he thinks they need to change. And the way he defines that change is they have to go back to what they were meant to do, to the core mission. And the core mission just so happens is something that is helpful for the United States and that the United States supports. So it's bringing peace to the world. I think he really would like the United Nations to be like the assistant to his own peace plans, to kind of follow up his peace plans. And then financial stability. America likes financial stability because it helps the American economy. So that's his plan, is to focus them back on the core missions and get rid of all the extraneous woke nonsense that he thinks has built up around that, which is things like dealing with climate, dealing with human rights, dealing with trade, and giving more power to the global South.
You you said that the U.S. basically hates the rules, but if I remember it correctly, the U.S. and of course with the Soviet Union created the UN, created this system, the real-based world order. So I don't understand that. If they created it, why isn't it working for them?
Well, Trump is coming from a very different position than the people who created these institutions. Trump is a real break in American politics. In fact, he represents quite a long strand of thinking in America. And, there always has been this irony that the US created the United Nations and created a lot of international organizations. But there's always been a group of people in America who think these things are part of a giant conspiracy to tie America's hands. And Trump represents that strand of thinking, which has always been there, but which has never been in the White House before. It's never been controlling the American foreign policy. Now, for the first time, it is. And so Trump has a very different view of what is the national interest. Of course, the people who created the UN and the World Trade Organization and even the human rights, participated in the Human Rights Council and the Bretton Woods institutions and all of that. They did it because they think, and America's commitment to climate, all of this stuff wasn't some giant act of charity to the rest of the world. It was done because that was their vision of what served Americans' interests. Having a rules-based order, having strong alliances, acting together on global challenges, global diseases that can travel across the world and infect Americans just as easily as anyone else, bringing stability to other parts of the world where, controlling populations, which also has an impact on stability, all of these things. But Trump has a much narrower view of the American national interest. So the problem with Trump is not, from my mind, is not that he is pursuing American interests, which is what he should be doing as the American president. It's just that his vision of American interests is rather more limited than has traditionally been the view in the United States. Perhaps some American leaders went too far in thinking America should be the policeman of the world and so on. Perhaps a reaction against that is overdue, but Trump is taking it to a striking degree in the way he defines interests.
I heard an interesting opinion that the US created these institutions to push or promote democracies over the world, and therefore the end of history will come. But they made a mistake. The US made a mistake because China followed the rules, and still China isn't a democracy. US thought that if a country became a capitalist country, it will become a democracy. But what we can see in China, it's quite the opposite. What's your take on that?
I think that's absolutely right. So a lot of these institutions were set up, first of all, after the Second World War, they were set up to try and prevent another world war. Then very quickly it was the Cold War. And then America set up a lot of institutions which were basically designed to protect the what America liked to describe as the free world against the spread of communism. Then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was this, okay, what do we do now? And the response was, let's expand these institutions, which were meant to reinforce cooperation among the democracies. Let's expand them to the whole world. And exactly as you say, the theory was that tying China and other countries into this American liberal order will bring them inevitably to look more like America. And so free trade will create a middle class, and then they'll want democracy.
Yeah.
And
we can see that like almost every leader of the communist movement in China or in Vietnam are coming from a European university.
Yeah.
So interesting.
That's right, absolutely. But they're not becoming European.
Yeah.
So I think there was a mistake there. And it was summed up in this idea that it would make China a responsible stakeholder. But, it's really I think, given China a taste for, how it can use the system for its own purposes. And China is pursuing the interest, as the Chinese regime sees it within the system, which turns out to be slightly different from the policy that we wanted them to have. And I think a lot of the debates about multilateralism and international organizations now stem from exactly that. Instead of turning China into a country that agrees with us, it means now we have to share power in these organizations with a country that profoundly disagrees with us.
There are two goals in the US right now, as I see. The one is make America great again. So we have to spend more money in America to build infrastructure, etc., etc. But they still want to lead the world. And what do you think? Can the USA lead the world while they are leaving these international organizations?
My view would be not. I was never that keen on the idea. Of course, under Biden, you saw exactly the combination that you described. So President Biden really wanted the United States to lead the world, but he was also committed to having what he called a foreign policy for the middle class. And that meant, he wouldn't have used these terms, but it meant make America great again. It meant bring prosperity back to America. It meant stop Americans voting for people like Donald Trump. It meant, make America see, more prosperity, more jobs, and show them that our international policy is linked to that.
And maybe with Biden, maybe the Democrats could defeat Trump. But with Kamala, maybe she was too woke for the Americans. I don't know. I
don't think that. I think Biden would have lost the election even more than Kamala Harris. I think Biden's vision was a little bit old-fashioned. I don't think that Americans really want to lead the world anymore. And I think they feel like it was, of course, there are many different views in America, but that idea that America has to be leading the world, I think, is less prevalent than it was now. And I think it's a little bit out of date. And I think it's expensive to try and lead the world. I think power is shifting, wealth is shifting, and we need a little bit more of a kind of sharing the burden and cooperation. But Trump has flipped from the old position to something where he doesn't work with allies at all. He doesn't see any value in international cooperation. And there, I think, that's very wrong. There's some obviously complicated questions about how you cooperate in a world of rivalries and wars like we have now. But I don't think the answer is to tear up all the institutions and to spit on your allies. I think it has to be more cooperation at this point rather than less, but perhaps cooperating in a different way. Of course there are questions to be answered, but I think that and Trump also is a little bit in a way, I think the idea that America has the power to doesn't need allies because it's so powerful it can do everything itself is a little bit like the flip side of the idea that America should lead the world. It still is like seeing this great power for America. And also Trump turns out quite like, having some small wars as long as they're quite limited.
Last question for this topic. Who started the undermining of the international organizations? Because we see that the Chinese created the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's kind of the opposite than the UN. And Chinese more likely to do business with one-to-one than one-to-many. So who started the undermining, China or the US?
I think the undermining had many parents. China, I think it joined these institutions with a very different approach to running its economy and a very different set of values. They say that they are complying with the rules of the World Trade Organization, but their economy is so different and so state-centric with all these kind of hidden links that it's, in the eyes of many, is kind of unfair the way that they're approaching the system. It's not the Belt and Road Initiative is fine. It's a bilateral thing. I don't think that undermines the institutions per se, but I think the institutions they were set up for a world that was very different. And now we have these rival economic systems and rival political systems that are all kind of within the same system. And then we have a lot of countries in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia that feel that they're excluded and that they don't have the power they should. Why is it that the UN Security Council still has Britain and France, but not India or Brazil
or Germany or Japan?
Or Germany or Japan. It seems a little strange.
Yeah.
And so, the system, I think, And then it's getting harder to make the system work. Look at the wars we've had in the last, 10 years. Syria, Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan. The Security Council has been powerless to do anything. And so if the UN can't, bring peace, then there's some big questions about how well it's working.
There are an ideology, the liberalism, which promotes international organizations.
Yeah.
And there is another realism, which basically promotes the opposite. Basically promotes that a nation state should act as like the national interest dictates. So are we in an era of realism right now?
Well, I don't completely accept the distinction because, as I said, I think the liberal view is that these institutions serve the national interest. They're not an act of charity. So perhaps there's a difference in view about how to achieve the national interest best. And I think the real distinction probably is that the realists see ultimately everything as a question of balance of power. And, national power matters more than the kind of type of regime that's in the country. So you look at, China as a rising power, you look at the United States as the kind of predominant power that's losing relative to China, and that's all you need to know. You don't need to know, China is communist or whatever it is now, or the United States is democracy or whatever it is now. And so, that's the kind of the realist view. It's all about relative power. Whereas liberalism is more like there's scope for cooperation. It matters what kind of regimes there are. The democracies should work together. That, I think, is the distinction. I think we are shifting a bit more towards a realist world. As we've discussed, the institutions are on the back foot. They're on the defensive. There's more conflict in the world. And a lot of the organizations that were set up to help countries cooperate are now, in fact, being used for competition. So in areas like trade, we see a lot of use of trade tools for competition. Sanctions, of course, tariffs, of course, and other measures. We've seen China restricting its export of rare earths. So the links between countries are becoming weapons to use against other countries. And I think we see, instead of a common system, we see more countries jockeying for advantage, rival power blocks emerging. We're still halfway between that world and the liberal world. And there are two different systems that are sort of struggling. And that's why I think things are so messy at the moment.
Yeah, but our second topic for today is the European Union, the human rights, because we are supporting Ukraine because Ukraine has been attacked by Russia. It's obvious.
Yeah.
But there are some moves in the European foreign policy, which is kind of, well, I cannot understand it. Let's say that. For example, in Syria, we are supporting the current government, which is basically oppressing minorities. There were terror attacks against minorities, against Christians. Thousands of them died. And still, the European Union and also the US decided to loosen the sanctions towards Syria. So why do you think that the European Union on one side try to promoting values like in Ukraine, but in Syria, for example, they are acting against European values?
I'm not sure that I agree with that analysis. So I think the sanctions were put on because of the way that the previous regime under President Assad was treating the population of their country. And there's no doubt that under Assad, we saw some of the worst violations of human rights that any government in the world was carrying out against its own population. There were, tens of thousands of people who were being captured, who were being tortured, civilians were being killed in the war. It was a very brutal regime, and the response of the world, there was some debate, should there be intervention to stop this, should there not? In the end, the response really was one of sanctions. And these sanctions were put in place because of the brutality of the regime.
And also that shows that the UN Security Council couldn't agree because the Russians supported Assad. So
that's correct. That was another issue with the Security Council. Even to refer Assad to the International Criminal Court could not be put through the Security Council. But I think that was certainly a big reason why there was no intervention. Perhaps not the only reason, because sometimes there's been intervention for humanitarian reasons, even without authorization by the Security Council. But that was certainly an important reason. But I think that, Assad fell, and now there's a new regime which is trying to establish itself in the country. Clearly, the regime that's there now, under the leader, Shara, came from an Islamist background. Yeah. And it grew out of a terrorist organization. Now, that's a challenge, but they've renounced their links to terrorism some years ago. And broadly speaking, I think the policy of the Europeans has been to watch what they do and judge on that basis. And so far, most of the language that they've used has been one of inclusion, has been one of trying to restore the country and turn their backs on the kind of oppression and division of under President Assad. Now, it hasn't been all smooth sailing. There has been some kind of fighting within the country. And I think it's right to look at, closely at what's happening. But there's also resistance against the regime as it tries to establish itself. It doesn't have control of the country. There are some elements within the country that are still supporting the previous regime and are fighting against the new one. And so I think, it's so far we're in a stage where it's not easy to say, is this just the new regime is trying to establish itself and put down pockets of resistance, or is it really systematically oppressing minorities? You have one analysis, which is that it's driven by an oppression of minorities. My analysis would be that we can't say that yet, and that they deserve the benefit of the doubt.
So you think that it's too early to say that?
Yeah, that's what I think. I think it's right to lift sanctions. I think it's right to give this new government a chance, but of course to watch carefully and see what they do. But I think for the moment, it's potentially a new start for the Syrian people after a terrible regime. And I think it's right to support that new start while also watching carefully to make sure that it doesn't go in a bad direction. And if it does start to consistently go in a bad direction, then we respond then.
In Europe, we have lots of problems. Like we have security problem, migration problem, and it seems like that we have human rights problems as well. For example, freedom of religion against freedom of free expression, or things like that. Are we heading towards a future where there are no rights for people, tyranny basically, or where are we heading? Because as I see, in every part of Europe, there are problems with the basic human rights.
That's a very gloomy analysis. Human rights is not...
Of course, different parts.
Yeah.
In every area. For example, in Western Europe, Germany, or in France, there is a clash between freedom of religion and freedom of free expression, or
Yeah.
freedom of art and freedom
Yeah.
of religion.
Yeah.
And the state has to solve this problem, because we saw that if someone draws Mohammed, he will die. And that's not we don't want to live in this Europe, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think freedom of expression is very important. And I think human rights is, it's not a simple kind of grid that not a simple template that you just put down and everything fits. There can be difficulties and tensions within human rights. And one of the tensions is, how do you reconcile the need to respect other religions and allow people to choose for themselves how they want to follow their religion, but not limit the legitimate free speech rights of other people. And, I would like to tilt quite far towards free speech and not worry too much about offending people. But, there are some forms of speech that would be seen as incitement to hatred, or something like that, and then that would be grounds for restricting them. As our societies have become more religiously diverse, there are people within our societies who have different views, and that creates difficulties. And we're kind of working through that. And then there also is a public security question. And definitely there have been some problems. And I think these problems about expressions, whether it's drawing pictures of Prophet Muhammad or other forms of speech, or, around religious issues, have been a flashpoint. And I don't think our societies have always got those decisions right, or at least not the way I support them. But I think we're a long way from dictatorship and tyranny, just because there are one or two controversial questions about exactly how we define freedom of expression.
But what if Western Europe has lots of migrants? In France, in Britain,
lots of
migrants in it, and it seems like that the majority of migrants don't want to accept our rules, accept how we think, freedom of speech, human rights, etc. I met some of them and spoke with them, and they were, let's say, extremely radical about different things. Can we make them Europeans, or can we teach them how to respect the rights of others? Because that's the main point. If we can teach them, it's okay, they can stay. But if they can't do this, then it will be extremely hard.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's important that migrants who are coming to our countries should ultimately accept the system of values that we have in our countries. I would hope that our system of values are one that show respect for other religions and, other religious practices up to, and only up to the point where they don't infringe other people's rights. And where they do infringe rights, then I think the rights have to come first, because those are the values of the societies that we're living in. So I agree with that. And I think there have been some problems in some cases. To my mind, the problems are not on a scale that means that we should question the whole feasibility of migration or of assimilation. I think, the overall record is still positive. But I think there are questions about the pace of immigration, the levels of people that we can bring in at particular times. I think there are questions about the way that they're, are they being integrated into our societies, or are they sort of remaining in little enclaves where they're preserving their own culture? Are they being offered the kinds of, opportunities that would help them integrate? These are all questions. And I think large-scale immigration from, from regions that have quite different value systems, or religions that have different value systems, can be a challenge. So it's, I think it is one that our societies are capable of meeting, but I think people want to see that migration is taking place in an orderly way, and the way that where the government is retaining control and not happening in a way that leads them to feel that their values of their society are being undermined. Because if that happens, then you will get, hostility towards migrants, and then that leads to, of course, to problems.
Our time is up, and I would like to thank you for this eye-opening conversation.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for the invitation.